All right, idea class. So we're going to start our next book of Paddington Bear, which is Paddington Marches On. Okay? The first chapter is called The Cold Snap. So I'm going to read half the chapter to you today and half the chapter to you the next time. So right now, though, think about cold snap. What do you think it means when Paddington and the cold snap? So I want you to pause the video and look under your assignment. There's a submission button, and have your parents help you write in what your thoughts are about what a cold snap is. So go ahead and do that right now. All right, so we'll start. And here is the picture. So see if you were right based on this picture. Okay, were you right? Okay, Paddington stood on the front doorstep of number 32 Windsor Gardens and sniffed the morning air. He peered out through the gap between his duffel coat hood and a brightly colored scarf which was wound tightly about his neck. On the little that could be seen of his face behind some unusually white-looking whiskers, there was a mixture of surprise and excitement as he took in the sight which met his eyes. Overnight, a great change had come over the weather. Whereas the day before had been mild, almost spring-like for early January, now everything was covered by a thick white blanket of snow, which reached almost to the top of his Wellington boots. Not a sound disturbed the morning air, apart from the clatter of breakfast things in the kitchen where Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were busy washing up. The only sign that he wasn't alone in the world came from the row of milk bottle tops poking through the snow on the steps, and a long trail of footprints where the postman had been there earlier today. Paddington liked snow, but as he gazed at the view into the street outside, he almost agreed with Mrs. Bird, the Browns' housekeeper, that it was possible to have too much of a good thing. So Paddington liked snow. He thought snow was good, but too much snow was not good. It was too much of a good thing. Since he had been living with Mrs. Brown's family, there had been several of Mrs. Bird's cold snaps, but he couldn't remember ever seeing one in which the snow had settled quite so deep and crispy and even. All right, so there's your definition of a cold snap. Did you get it right? It means when the temperature drops and it gets cold for a little while. All the same, Paddington wasn't the sort of bear to waste a good opportunity, and a moment or so later he closed the door behind him and made his way down the side of the house as quickly as he could in order to investigate the matter. Apart from the prospect of playing snowballs, he was particularly anxious to test his new Wellingtons, which had been standing in his bedroom waiting for just such a moment ever since Mrs. Brown had given to him at Christmas. So his Christmas present had been snow boots, or Wellingtons, which is a type of snow boot. As he reached Mr. Brown's cabbage patch, Paddington busied himself scooping the snow up with his paw and rolling it into firm round balls, which he threw at the clothes post. But after several of the larger ones narrowly missed hitting the next door greenhouse, instead he hastily turned his attention to the more important task of building a snowman. And gradually peace returned once again to Windsor Gardens. It was some while later, just as he was adding the finishing touches to his snowman's head with some old lemonade bottle tops, that the quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of a nearby window being flung open. "Bear," called a loud voice. "Is that you, Bear?" Paddington jumped in alarm as he lifted his duffel coat hood and caught sight of the Browns' next-door neighbor leaning out of his bedroom window. Mr. Curry was dressed in PJs and his dressing gown, and half of his face was hidden behind a large white handkerchief. So here is Paddington's bear snowman. That's what it looks like, a bear snowman. "I've finished throwing snowballs, Mr. Curry," explained Paddington hastily. "I'm making a snowman instead." To his surprise, Mr. Curry looked unusually friendly as he lifted the handkerchief from his face. "Oh, that's all right, Bear," he called out in a mild tone. "I wasn't grumbling. I just wondered if you would care to do me a small favor and earn yourself a 10 pence for bun money into the bargain." "I've caught a nasty cold in my nose," he said, and Paddington climbed up the box to peer at the man's face over the fence. "A cold in your nose, Mr. Curry?" repeated Paddington, looking most worried. He had never heard of anyone having a cold in their nose before, and he stared at the window with interest. Mr. Curry took a deep breath. "Not a nose, my nose," As if it wasn't enough, my system is also frozen. Paddington became more and more upset as he listened to Mr. Curry, and he nearly fell off his box with alarm at the last piece of information. "Your system's frozen?" he exclaimed. "I'll ask Mrs. Bird to send for Dr. Andrew." Mr. Curry snorted. "I don't want a doctor, Bear," he said crossly. "I need a plumber. It's not my pipes that are frozen. It's my water pipes. There isn't even enough water left in the tank to fill my hot water bottle." Paddington looked slightly disappointed as the heavy object wrapped in a piece of paper landed at his feet. "That's my front door key," explained Mr. Curry. "I want you to take it along to Mr. James, the odd job man. Tell him to come at once. I shall be in bed, but he can let himself in. And tell him not to make too much noise. I need to sleep. And I'm not hanging about the bun shop on the way home either. Otherwise, you're not going to get your 10 pence. With that, Mr. Curry blew his nose violently several times, slammed his window shut. Mr. Curry was well known in the neighborhood for his meanness. He had a habit of promising people a reward for running errands, but somehow, whenever the time for payment arrived, he was never to be found. Paddington had a nasty feeling in the back of his mind that this was going to be one of those occasions, and he stood staring at the empty window for some moments before he turned and made his way slowly in the direction of Mr. James' house. "Curry!" exclaimed Mr. James as he stood in his doorway. "Did you say Curry?" "That's right, Mr. James," said Paddington. "His system is frozen, and he can't even fill his hot water bottle." "Hard luck," said the odd job man unsympathetically. "I'm having enough trouble with my own pipes this morning, let alone that of Mr. Curry's. Besides, I know him. He hasn't paid me for the last job I did, and that was 6 months ago. Tell him I want to see the color of his money first before I do anything else." Paddington looked most disappointed as he listened to Mr. James. For the little he could remember of Mr. Curry's money, it was unusually very dirty, as if it had been kept under lock and key for a long time. He felt sure Mr. James would even be less keen on the job if he saw the dirty money. "Tell you what," said the odd job man, relenting slightly as he caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. "Hang on a tick. Seeing you've come a long way in the snow, I'll see what I can do to oblige." Mr. James disappeared from view only to return a moment later carrying a large brown paper parcel. "I'm lending Mr. Curry a blow lamp, and I've slipped a book on plumbing in as well. He might have a few tips if he gets stuck." "A blow lamp?" exclaimed Paddington, his eyes growing large and larger. "I don't think he's going to like that very much." "You can take it or you can leave it," said Mr. James. "It's all the same to me, but if you want my advice, Bear, you'll take it. This weather's going to get a lot worse before it gets better." So saying, Mr. James bade a final goodbye and closed his door firmly, leaving Paddington standing on the step with a very worried expression on his face as he stared at the parcel in his hands. Mr. Curry didn't even have a very good temper at the best of times, and the thought of waking him in order to hand over a blow lamp or even a book on plumbing, especially when he had a bad cold, filled Paddington with alarm. Paddington's face grew longer and longer the more he thought about it, but by the time he turned to make his way back to Windsor Gardens, his whiskers were so well covered with flakes that only the closest passerby would have noticed that anything was amiss. Mrs. Brown paused in her housework as a small figure hurried past the window. "I suppose," she said with a sigh, "we can look forward to the paw prints all over the house for the next few days." "If this weather keeps up, that Bear'll have to watch more than his paws," said Mrs. Bird. "He'll have to mind his P's and Q's as well." The Browns' housekeeper held very strict views on the subject of dirty floors, particularly when there were results of Bear's goings-on in the snow, and she followed Paddington's progress into Mr. Brown's garage with a disapproving look. "I think he must be helping the next-door neighbor," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington came into view again, clutching something beneath his duffel coat. "It sounds as if Mr. Curry's having trouble with his pipes." "I hope that's all he's having trouble with," said Mrs. Bird. "There's been far too much hurrying about this morning for my liking." Mrs. Bird was not very happy when Paddington helped out, and several times she caught sight of him going past the kitchen window with what looked suspiciously like a piece of old piping sticking out of his duffel coat. Even as she spoke, the renewed burst of hammering came from the direction of Mr. Curry's bathroom and echoed round the space between the house. First there was one or two bangs, then a whole series which grew louder and louder, finally ended in a loud crash and a period of silence, broken only by the steady hiss of a blow lamp. All right, so that's where we're going to stop today. So what do you think Paddington is up to? Think about that for when we finish the story on Thursday. Okay, what could Paddington be up to? He's been walking past the window with pipes sticking out of his coat. There's hammering coming from Mr. Curry's bathroom, and Mr. Curry is sick in bed, not wanting anyone to bother him. So what do you think Paddington has gotten himself into? All right, we'll catch you next time.